this point in time, the focus really is on taking the foundation's work to rural parts of the country where, I mean, there is virtually a broken healthcare system. So forget talking about mental health being addressed in any meaningful or substantial way. What has that experience been like, and what do you intend to really do?
So there's three things that we focus on as an organization, and we like to call it the 3 A's, easy to remember. The first A is accessibility, is awareness. Awareness of mental health. The second A is accessibility. Accessibility of not just information, but also resources, and of course, both of those being credible. And then the third part of it is affordability. So these are the 3 A's with which we run our rural mental health program as well. Sort of challenges that mental illness in the country is facing, right? So what we're really trying to achieve is to be able to provide not just free psychiatric treatment, but also vocational training, rehabilitation, an equal and important focus on caregivers, wherein the sort of care is given not just to the individual and the family, but also at a community level. So we actually call it a community mental health program. And we're seeing a lot of sort of transformative stories at an individual level, but also there is a success story out of Davangere, which is a district in Karnataka, about 6 hours away from Bangalore, where we've actually given the onus of running the program back to the community. So it's actually a self-sustainable model as well. So over a period of time, it takes time, 5 to 7 years, Davangere as a district is running its own mental health program with the help of the local health workers, your ASHA workers and Anganwadi workers, as well as the local administration, all under the district mental health program. So that's really what we're trying to achieve. What we're seeing is typically, there is a lot of, just like in urban India, there is a lot of stigma as well as, say, lack of awareness. There's also a lot of belief in religious practices and faith healers. So we have to go into the system, be extremely patient in our approach, which is why I keep harping on 5 to 7 year period, right? So this is something that takes time. At the end of the day, social change and behavior cannot be achieved overnight. So this is what we're doing, and this past year alone, we've been running this program since 2016, and this past year alone, we've actually impacted about 13,000 people across 6 states. We've trained about 4,000 healthline workers, and about 20 to 25,000 caregivers have been provided psychosocial support, counseling, etc.
Well, congratulations. That does deserve a big round of applause, because it's not easy to scale. And that's what I wanted to address. What has been the big challenge of being able to take this to scale?
So we're in that phase now where we're actually, looking to really scale it large. And I think, fortunately, we have access to individuals on our board who are really some really bright minds. So we've actually been working over the last 6 to 8 months on stabilizing a lot of the aspects of scale, and I would say that they're not too different from the way you'd look at a business. So looking at aspects of standardization, or unit economics, and ensuring that a lot of that is getting better. And thirdly, of course, working with good grassroots level partners who can help you scale. Then there's also the aspect of integrating technology wherever possible, because obviously your reach gets better. So there's various aspects of scale. And once all of this is done, there's no doubt that partnering with either state or central governments really helps scale at a larger level.
Yeah. Madam Commissioner, back to you. I want to, through the course of your journey, you've had many instances where you've actually gone up against the system at large, or against your seniors in specific or in particular. And I think this is a dilemma that many people in the room are faced with as well, or face at many points in their life. You talk about a particular incident where you went against a senior officer where there were questions being raised about corruption and so on and so forth. And you said that you will not acknowledge the fact that there was no wrongdoing because you believe that there was wrongdoing. What gave you the strength, and what is the message that you would like to leave here to people who face these dilemmas of what is the right thing to do and when to stand up for them?
So each person has to decide what's right for him or her. But these two instances, in one case, when I was a young SP, my IG asked for money in front of me. And not only did I object, I wrote an urgent letter to my Director General of Police, who instituted an inquiry, but till the IG was shifted, Every day he would issue me one memo. And mind you, we also have to take our team along. The memo I would reply every day, but when that inquiry officer came, this sub-inspector from whom he had asked for money, you know what he told the inquiry officer? He said, sir, आप IPS हैं, मैडम IPS है, IG साहब ने पैसा मांगा, वो IPS हैं, आप मेरा बलि का बकरा बनाएंगे क्या? So what our juniors feel, you know what they have to go through. And in second case, the minister asked for 3 acres of land. I have covered it in my book, which actually belonged to police. And I felt a wrong kind of process of auctioning had been undertaken, and that piece of land was being given to a private builder. And now you know this Porsche case, how powerful the builders and the developers are. When I refused, the price I had to pay was that instead of being made chief of state CID crime headquartered in Pune, it was denied to me, and I had to accept the post of chief of prisons, which was fine with me. I knew I had to pay a price, so I think it totally depends on us. I was ready to pay the price, but I could save that 3 acres of land which belongs to police.
You may have paid the price by not getting a position that you deserve to get, but you sleep well at night, and your conscience is clear. You know, we were talking about the need for judicial reforms, but let's also talk about the need for reforms within the police force as well. 36 years on, you've spent your life in uniform, almost 4 decades in the Indian Police Service. What do you believe is the pressing need of the hour? Where do you believe urgent intervention is required?
So as of today, all the postings, Commissioner of Police, Director General of Police, SP of a district, Superintendent of Police of a district, or the SHO of your police station, the officer in charge of the police station, they are all being appointed by politicians mainly. And it's not a merit which is the criteria, but mera aadmi, tera aadmi, that is the criteria. So I feel Supreme Court has said that all these appointments should be by a board, and the board should also have leaders from opposition and some civil society workers. I feel appointment of police officers or administrative services or all services should be on the basis of merit, and it should be taken away from the politicians. We have to find some way, and more women in police. Today we have only 12% women in police. And now you, in Bengaluru and in Karnataka, you would be handling this explosive case of sexual exploitation.
Yeah.
If you don't have women, you will not have women victims and complainants coming forward and sharing the trauma. So it's not only offenses against women which need more women officers, but general crime situation, if you have to handle, investigate properly, we need more women.
How do we get that number to go from 12% to 50%? What will it take to get more women into the police force?
So one, that way India has been very progressive. Most states have reservation. But then we have to encourage women to come forward and take advantage of the reservation. Families are sometimes pulling them back. At least from the law enforcement point of view, families feel that because we don't have 8 hours duty, every constable in the country, irrespective of the state, every police officer works for 14 hours a day. Now to have responsibility which is professional and also to be homemakers, caretakers at home, this is very difficult. So I would say if you have 8 hours duty, more women will join, and discussing the need to have more women in law enforcement. If we encourage them, I think we will be able to reach at least 33%, which is the reservation as of today.
Anisha, you know, talking about the road ahead, and especially when we talk about bridging the gap, you know, as far as mental health, addressing mental health is concerned, what is the ask of the private sector from the government, for instance? You know, insurance is a big aspect. We have now seen some positive movement on that front, for instance. What are the asks from the government and from the private sector at large as well to ensure that we make this accessible, we make this affordable?
So I think one of the defining moments where mental health is concerned was the Mental Health Care Act of 2017, and I think there's a lot within that act. It's in my opinion a you talked about Deepika's sort of interview as being a watershed moment. I think the Mental Health Care Act is also one. So I think there are a lot of sort of asks within that. And I think having that legislation in place is useful. But the implementation of some of those points would be useful. So one of them being insurance coverage for mental health, which is something that we're trying to work on at a policy level. Then the other sort of salient feature was that suicide was decriminalized back in 2017. So I think there are definitely a lot of aspects that can be worked upon from a policy level. But I would say number one that would impact not just our generation but future generations as well is to ensure that insurance coverage is actually translates to being provided on the ground.
So today, as a philanthropist, as an entrepreneur, what has been your biggest learning? What has been your biggest realization for you personally? From the work that you're doing?
I mean, there's mental health realizations, there's general realizations. Honestly, I just feel a lot of gratitude to be able to do what I'm doing. To be able to have found two things that I'm extremely passionate about, golf first and now this. And I think just being able to help people at their time or moment of extreme need. I'm not a mental health professional, but sort of being that person that they reach out to or that organization that they reach out to, in a sense, giving them the light that they see at the end of the tunnel is something that I know me and my team really look forward to, and hopefully we'll be able to impact a lot more lives as well.
If there was women's IPL when you were actually playing cricket, could we have seen you heading in that direction?
Maybe, I don't know. Maybe if there was IPL, I would have continued. I actually represented Karnataka at the under-16 level. I was the youngest on the team at the time.
Well, you can live many lives in one, and I think Anisha is a classic example of that. Madam Commissioner, before I let you go, your message to the women in this room, to the young women who are watching, to parents who are watching and listening to you, what is it that you would like to say to them?
Okay, can I quote Maya Angelou?
Yes, of course you can.
Oh, I've ended my book with her quote, "My mission in life is not merely to survive. My mission in life is not merely to survive, but to thrive, and to do so with some passion, some compassion, some humor, and some style." So we should all pitch for that.
What a wonderful start to the Bengaluru edition of Future Female Forward. Madam Commissioner Anisha Padukone, thank you very much for kickstarting the conversations. We wish both of you the very best of luck and appreciate you taking time out to be with us here today. Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause.
Thank you.